It has been fascinating that while very obvious that happy employees lead to happy customers, if it's so obvious, why isn't everyone doing it? And why isn't everyone doing it well?
Welcome to This is Digital, a podcast brought to you by West Monroe. Join us as we talk to leading experts about bringing the digital mindset to your organization.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to This is Digital, a podcast about leading with digital to win in the marketplace. I'm your host, Rissa Redden, partner and chief marketing officer here at West Monroe. West Monroe is a digital services firm. We are thinkers and makers who bring hands-on experience and technical know-how to get things done and to deliver lasting value. On This is Digital, we talk to experts about how to go about not just doing digital, but being digital. We'll be sharing stories of digital successes and digital failures. This podcast is for business leaders like you who don't want to miss out on the opportunities digital holds. I'm joined today by two great guests, Tiffani Bova and Pablo Alejo. Tiffani is the Global Growth and Innovation Evangelist at Salesforce, in addition to being a best-selling author of the book Growth IQ and host of her own podcast, What's Next? Joining the discussion from the West Monroe team is Pablo, an industry veteran who has seen every major digital trend come and go and considers himself fortunate to have been a part of them all. Both Tiffani and Pablo bring a fascinating perspective on what the customer experience should look like in today's digital age and give us some examples of who is doing it right. I'm excited for the insight you will all hear throughout the episode and to learn more about what it means to put the customer first. With that being said, welcome Tiffani Bova and Pablo Alejo. Tiffani, I'm so excited to talk with you today. I feel like there is much to cover, and I would love to start with a little bit of your background and what led you to where you are today.
Let me start by saying thank you for having me. I am blessed to have been in tech now for almost 30 years. It's been a little north of 25 years. I started out as a quota-carrying sales rep, then moved up into leadership and management for both sales, marketing, and customer service at startups as well as Fortune 500. And then I spent a decade at Gartner being a research fellow covering sales transformation, go-to-market models, and growth sort of overall, which was a really fun decade. And now I've been at Salesforce for about 7 years, doing kind of the same thing I was doing at Gartner, but doing it for us and for our clients. And so it's been an amazing 25 years for sure.
And to think about all the things that you have seen and where people have gotten it right or gotten it wrong. You've spent most of your career helping companies transform how they engage with customers, creating customer experiences to grow their businesses. What are some of the most common questions that you receive about helping to engage with customers?
I'll tell you, over the decade that I was advising clients as an analyst, it was often they were looking for sort of what is the one thing I should be doing, right? What is the one thing I should be focused on? Either because they're seeing a growth stall or because they are in kind of a hyper growth mode, if you will. And I'm here to sort of say the one thing about growth is it's never one thing. And I was part of the team at Gartner that made the prediction that the chief marketing officer would spend more on technology than the chief information officer. And we made that prediction around, it was like 2008 or 2009. We thought it would come true sort of 2014, 15. And we were pretty close to nailing the timeline, but it was not about the technology. We knew that CMOs were going to start to take more and more ownership and control over the experience that customers had with brands. And there was no way to do that without engaging digitally, right? So that digital transformation spend, if you will, really was about this advantage of experience and customer experience being one of them, but it's also online and offline. So it's not just the CMO, right? It's everybody who has customer-facing roles, product developers, web developers, call center, marketing, sales, all of those groups that have some kind of engagement with a customer plays a role in that experience they get from companies.
And it becomes a challenge if you've got lots of different players. How do you create that golden record that gives you a sense of that 360 experience, which is challenging or can be challenging to coordinate? Would you agree with that as far as trying to bring all of those voices to the experience?
So I'd say this, if I go back 15 years, I think that we were really advocating for the CMO to have a seat at the table because we knew experience was going to be sort of the next competitive battleground of where brands were going to compete. And so I think initially the ownership was the conversation. Okay, who's going to own it? Who gets the headcount? Who gets the budget? And I think over the last 15 years, many companies, if not all, have really realized that isn't about owning it. It isn't about, having control over it. It's about everybody in the company playing their part in that experience. And so while there may be a metric like a Net Promoter Score or NPS, that the CMO may be responsible for tracking and driving and sharing and communicating and understanding where and how you have the ability to improve NPS. It's broader than that. But I would say that is, I hope we've moved past the ownership conversation and the budget conversation, that every decision that companies make should have two sides to the same coin when it comes to experience. How do we improve the experience for a customer by reducing their effort and increasing sort of that experience they have, while at the same time doing the same for our employees?
And I love that. I want to pick up on the comment that you made about customer experience and employee experience, that you have written before about connecting employee and customer experience to drive growth is really where the magic happens. And how did you come to that realization, and how does that manifest?
I was standing on stage a number of years ago and I said, I didn't think it was a coincidence that Salesforce is a great place to work, which is where I work, right? It's one of the most innovative companies in the world and the fastest growing enterprise software company. Those three things I just said are not statements that Salesforce has made. It's what the market has said. So if it's not a great place to work, if it's not number one, it's in the top 3 or 5 pretty much globally. And so I didn't think it was a coincidence, but make no mistake, I'm not the first person to sort of say there is a connection. Happy employees, happy customers, you get those two things right, you're going to have happy shareholders or grow faster, right? It's been said by Herb Kelleher, Richard Branson, our own CEO. I mean, it's been said by a lot of people. But there was very little research on looking for what attributes or elements of the employee experience play a part in improving that customer experience. So I spent the last sort of 2.5 years really digging into that with primary research, conversations, presentations, roundtables, CXO discussions. And it has been fascinating that while very obvious that happy employees lead to happy customers. If it's so obvious, why isn't everyone doing it? And why isn't everyone doing it well? And so then, usually executives will come back to me and say, well, we're doing great. And I go, look, the great resignation, quiet quitting, whatever term you want to use, is the result of this lack of investment we've made towards our employees for decades. It's not just since the pandemic. It's sort of at the turn of the third industrial revolution to the fourth industrial revolution as we started to digitize in the back office and automate to drive profitability and get more productivity out of employees. The experience for our employees actually declined, while in many cases the effort went up. And so we had the reverse effect. Customers, less effort, better experience. Employees, more effort, worse experience. And getting out of balance has led us to where we are right now, with many companies finding it hard to attract, retain talent, keep collaboration in this new hybrid work, as well as making sure we serve our customers.
Why would you say companies aren't getting it right?
Well, the research showed that first and foremost, for all intent and purposes globally, nobody owns employee experience. And that goes back to your comment a few minutes ago about who should own customer experience. And that's where it started, right? That's where it started. Who owns it? Okay, headcount, resources, budget, like all that conversation. Now we seem to be having that again, but we're having it on the employee side, which is a great conversation to have more broadly than just those things that are sort of traditionally owned by human resources or HR. And so it's broadening beyond that. So I think that because nobody owns it, people aren't focused on it. We survey our employees sometimes just once a year, which is never going to give you the pulse of what's happening. And then the other thing that was very telling was that employees felt like after the survey that all that data was not getting used to make their experience better as an employee. And executives agreed by saying, we have all this employee data, but we don't know what to do with it. So now all of a sudden it's this perfect storm. Employees aren't happy. They're telling the companies that they work for they're not happy. The companies aren't able to either uncover it and action it. And the executives just aren't or weren't paying attention. And now I think that believe that the pandemic has shined a light on the lack of that investment. And there's no longer an opportunity for executives of all size companies, startup, small, mid, and enterprise, that you cannot pay attention to those needs and wants of your people. You're never going to be able to deliver compelling experiences if your people aren't happy.
Tiffani, recently you've been posting about the importance of employee recognition and how, when done well, there are huge payoffs. What are your thoughts on how this plays into the overall customer experience?
Well, look, people want to be empowered and enabled to do their job for what they were hired to do. And unfortunately, career development, investment in shoring up outdated technology or outdated processes and systems takes a back seat to similar to what we were just talking about. Brands will, executives have shown through the research that they will always default to making sure that the customer experience is first and foremost, and sometimes at the expense of that. So employees were saying, listen, I want the systems and tools to do my job. The average enterprise has 900 or so applications, and only 29% of those are integrated. So if those applications aren't integrated, the burden falls on the employee. If you have a lack of career development or, actually investing in the long-term career progression of your people, they're going to leave to go get that experience or training somewhere else. And so we can no longer think that when someone is in a role, they're in a role for the long haul, right? They're going to say, I want more. I want the opportunity to move up or change groups or learn new skills. And that's where CEOs and CFOs have a disconnection of thoughts, right? The CFO's like, look, what if we invest in all these people from a career perspective and they leave? We've just wasted our money. But really the answer should be if we don't invest in them and they stay, they're not capable of using all the systems and tools, and they're not able to maybe do things that we need them to do now that we've changed our business models. So those kinds of employee investments are critical, but when people are pulling back on spend and really nervous about what's happening in the economy, sometimes the very first things to go are those things that are perceived as perks for employees that aren't really perks, right? It should be part of the overall support that you give to your employees, regardless of what's happening externally in the market.
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention your book, Growth IQ, which is a deep dive into how companies can restart or engage growth in their business. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, over the course of the decade at Gartner, I had about 4,500 conversations with executives from all size organizations, startups all the way to Fortune 5 companies. And it was a similar conversation regardless of size organization. So what I would often hear from executives is, well, we're different, Tiffani. You don't understand. Our business is different. And I'm like, maybe, but not really, right? Companies do two things. They make stuff, they sell stuff. If you're in a highly regulated industry, like financial services or something like that, I get that there is a unique things that you have to pay attention to. But when you think about it overall, the blocking and tackling of business, if you will, is the same. And so I wanted to be able to share, those lessons learned over those 4,500 conversations of really when it came down to it, there's only a handful of ways that businesses can grow, regardless of industry, regardless of sector, regardless of size. And so if I could make it something that was digestible, that people could read and bounce between the 10 growth paths I outlined, I felt like it was my way of scaling those conversations, which obviously I can't have every day, all day. And so it was really a culmination, if you will, of all my own personal experience of what I did to grow businesses, but more importantly, what the market and customers were saying to me as well.
Tiffani, I'd love to have another expert in the customer experience field join us. Pablo is one of our managing directors here at West Monroe and is incredibly passionate about the customer experience space. Pablo, could you tell us a little bit about your background and what you do here at West Monroe?
I started out way back in the day as a technologist. I was a developer, and it started making websites, interactive experiences in advertising. Advertising is probably where I spent the majority of my career, roughly about 15 years. Working at companies like AKQA, Crispin Porter McGusky, and a company out of Sydney, Australia called Reborn, really focusing on building experiences that people would love, but attached to advertising. And then as I started looking back at my career, the things that I enjoyed most were more about creating solutions that people actually enjoyed, which kind of led me into where I am now. And so I've worked at Fjord, which is a part of Accenture, and then came to West Monroe to lead design, which is more human-centered design thinking as the practice or specialty within West Monroe for our clients. And that's what I do.
We have talked a lot about customer experience and this idea of customer centricity. Why is that important? And I would love for you both to answer that. Maybe we start with you, Pablo.
It's funny. To me, I feel like customer centricity is really about how an organization orients what it does and how it behaves to the products and services they create. I've seen so many organizations where they are so focused on creating something to get to market without really kind of understanding what problem is it actually solving for users. And so for me, it's very critical and that an organization understands who their customer is, why and what their customer is trying to achieve, to then create the right products and services that actually kind of solve those needs. And honestly, it's funny, Tiffani, the way you were kind of framing up how employee experience impacts the customer experience. I mean, it's like the metaphor of the iceberg where the small part that you see is what consumers see, but the mass of what creates the experience is happening underwater is all of the employee experience that drives that overall customer experience. And so for me, when I hear about customer centricity, that's exactly what I think about, is how that thing flows from bottom all the way up. And so, to me, it's very critical.
I'd say the following. Look, not all customers are created equal. So customer centricity is about paying attention to those customers that obviously have the opportunity for higher profitability and more sales and more revenue, but not at the expense of everything else. And so if you think about the 80-20 rule, if 80% of your revenue comes from 20% of your customers, how do you take care of the 80% of customers, right, that are driving a smaller portion of your revenue in some kind of automated digital, not compromising experience, but maybe less human touch and more automation? So customer centricity is understanding those different customers across your entire portfolio of them, and then figuring out what is the best way to deliver these experiences that will create an opportunity for you to remain competitive, right, to keep them sticky, wanting more, all of those things. But I would say that it isn't that all customers, right, get the same level of service and get the same level of expensive touch, if you will. Ultimately, understanding your customer base allows you to be customer centric, right? What products do they want? How do they buy? Where do they want to buy? How do they want to be supported? And it isn't different, but you can't say we have 10,000 different kinds of customer personas. That's not manageable. And so getting to a manageable number, even starting by going back to what you were saying, Rissa, earlier, is that understanding of your customer, that 360, that data of the customer has to be consistent regardless of what part of the organization the customer is entering on. If you don't have that consistent data, there's no way for you to be customer centric.
Now, I'd love to go into a couple of examples. So, Tiffani and Pablo, from your perspective, what are some companies that are getting it right?
Listen, there's a lot that are held up. I love to use Southwest Airlines here in the United States for a couple of reasons. One, because it was at the beginning of the organization, they've always had this people first mentality, right? It's about being of service for both the employee and the customer, but starting with the employee, who they hire, how they train, what they provide, the culture of everybody's in this together, collaboration, that sort of, the heart, the love, the logo, the way they operate is very much a mental model of employee first. Will create this increased customer experience, and you get those two things right, you're going to have faster growth rates. And I think they've proven over time that has remained fairly constant, but it had to start at the top in everything that they did. You have other organizations that maybe were already established and they realized, we need to make some course corrections. Someone like a Unilever, right? Where you have a CEO who says, hold on, we want to be purpose driven, and that starts with our people, and how do we invest in them? Paul Pullman, who's no longer the CEO there, but really thinking about how do we make those investments to find talent, invest in talent. And if we can do that, we'll produce better products. If we're better stewards of the planet, we'll get our customers to feel like we're taking care of, what we're responsible for taking care of. And so you see it in different ways, either from the beginning or, they're making a course correction at some point in time because of either new leadership or, there's something, an M&A, something has happened to trigger them to say, okay, we really need to start to shore this up. So there's so many examples, Hilton Hotels, Lamborghini. I mean, there's a lot of really great examples of where companies have made this pivot, and those that get it right see the fruits of that labor.
Yeah, I think that the two that come to mind, I'll start with the bigger one because everyone will know them, is CVS. When I look at what they're doing and the acquisitions they are making, I mean, they're looking at a healthcare industry that is really disjointed. My doctor is one space that I go to, and when I get there, I have to go to maybe other specialists. And then when I go from there, I go to a pharmacy to get my medicine, and then I go through my treatment plan, and I have to come back to someone else. And it's very disjointed. And what CVS is doing is it's looking for ways to kind of create that connected experience for health. And you can see that in how they're kind of connecting the dots between when I go to the pharmacy, they have the Minute Clinic, but they're also looking at even expanding what that capability is. And then you look at even like what Amazon's doing of seeing what CVS has done and saying, well, we can play in this space too. And then with their acquisition of Aetna, taking all of that data, now you can see patient journeys and how they can then provide the right experiences to connect those dots. And so I look at what they're doing as an example of how to completely disrupt an industry that hasn't had to change for decades. And then at the same time, there's still spaces for people to be disrupted. I'd say, about 6 months ago, I got COVID and I did not want to leave my house. And I needed to figure out how to get to a doctor and find medication. And I just did a quick Google search and I came up with this company called Plush Care. And I didn't know what they were, but it was telehealth. And so I downloaded the app, pulled it up, and within minutes, I had scheduled an appointment and then had that appointment just about 15, 20 minutes later. And then quickly went through my diagnosis, went through everything I needed to. The doctor got me my prescription and I could have had it delivered directly to me. And I would have never had to have left the house. And they thought through every one of those moments along my journey of what I was going to need. Not just, hey, how can we get you scheduled in to meet the doctor, but the entire journey. And the doctor followed up via email, and we had a post conversation just to check in. And it was so frictionless, and it was very personalized to what I needed. And it's things like that where you think about what it takes to bring that together. To be honest, isn't that crazy? They're not inventing something new. They're just kind of putting it together in a way that matters to me. And that to me was very special. And so to me, when I look at organizations, it's not hard to create these types of innovations. They just have to be willing to kind of orient around the customer. And that's exactly what PlushCare has done. And it's what CVS is doing. And those to me are really great examples. I think like Tiffani was saying, in every industry, there's an exemplar somewhere. And these are the two that really kind of stood out to me.
If you were to give advice to somebody who is listening and thinking, I'm not sure our customer experience is where it needs to be, what would be a step one to investigate or to determine what a plan might be to improve that customer experience? Tiffani, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh, that's super easy for me. Ask your customers. It's super easy. It gets overcomplicated, right? I use Undercover Boss as a great example. That, the first sort of 5 minutes of that show in the US is putting hair and makeup on the executive so that they can be disguised when they're in front of their employees. And I'm like, it's such a waste of very expensive TV time, because at the end of the day, their people wouldn't recognize them anyway because they never leave their office. Because if they left their office, they would have known all those things were going on, right? Like, how do you not know that's what's happening in your warehouse or with your drivers? So, using Tom Peters, who wrote the book In Search of Excellence, co-author of In Search of Excellence, was management by wandering around. That is both for employees and for customers. Go visit your customers where they use the products or services you buy. Have roundtables, have discussions. Don't have it just be surveys and NPS scores, which is a moment in time. Get out there and understand what your customers want and need, why they bought from you, maybe why they left you, why they chose not to buy from you and buy from a competitor. If you always stay curious, thinking you know what's happening based on what your spreadsheet or your CRM tool is telling you is not a way to run the business. So it's a super simple answer. It's not complicated and it's not expensive.
What's your response to a question around, well, what if the customer doesn't know? Or what if the customer doesn't know that they yet need something that you have on offer? How would you counsel somebody there that if you were to ask your customer and your customer doesn't know or doesn't understand that they have a need for something new that you're doing, where would you turn then?
So the famous Steve Jobs quote, like if I ask my customers, they don't know what they want. Okay, there's one in a bazillion Steve Jobs in the world that sort of knows what customers want. If you're going to ask customers what they want, they'd say they wanted faster horses, which is the, Henry Ford quote. But there's two sides to this. One is talking to your customers about what you're currently doing. If you could get every single customer of yours to buy one more of what you already sell, right? Selling into the base. So it's not just about what they don't know they want or need in the future. It's about what are you doing today? And if you can pose it, once again, I'll use us as an example. When the pandemic first hit, we got challenged by our CEO, co-CEO, Mark Benioff at the time to say, he challenged us to have 1 million conversations with customers. Not 1 million demos, not 1 million, RFP responses, not 1 million quotes, 1 million conversations. And we blew that out. We had about 3.5 million. And now I think we're, well over 7 million at this point, but I digress. So the point was to have conversations. We had those conversations at the beginning of the pandemic, and it wasn't like, what do you need from us? Because to your point, they may not know. But if you're saying, okay, what are you trying to do in your business right now? Where are you finding it most difficult? What are the things? And so you're literally asking them in real time. We made adjustments to our rollout of, what was coming as far as feature and functionality enhancements, launched a new product, made an acquisition. Like we did a lot of things based on those quote unquote 3.5 million conversations now since then. So I'd say to you that there's two sides to it. One, asking them for future kind of jobs to be done mentality, like what is the job you're trying to do and how will that change? But ultimately, what do they get from you now? And that's only going to happen if you ask them a survey and it takes you 30 days, 60 days to field it and 30 or 60 days to analyze the data. You're 6 months out, that's already old. That's why those conversations, block an hour every day as an executive and talk to, half a dozen clients every day. Block an hour every day and talk to a half a dozen employees every day all over the organization. Do it for 90 days. And then make decisions about what you want to do in 2023.
Pablo, I know you think about this a lot as well. If somebody wants to evaluate their customer experience or make improvements to their customer experience, what advice do you have for them? How should they get started?
Well, to be honest, I feel like Tiffani said it just right. In the end, it starts with the customer. And without truly understanding what the customer is going through, it's very hard for us to really create anything of meaning. However, having said that, what's fascinating, David Ogilvy has this quote, and it says, consumers don't think how they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. And that's a very true statement. As humans, we're not machines. We're not programmable. Now, granted, there are certain things you can see and watch and see what happens, but there's a lot of alchemy into understanding how human behavior works. And what we find is just by asking isn't always the only method of research. It's observing what do they actually do? What are they trying to achieve? And that kind of helps us understand their motivation. And once you see that, then that kind of opens up the door. To Tiffani's point, people did not ask for an iPhone. Like that was never a question. We had the BlackBerry. It was doing everything you needed. It had buttons. And I actually remember when the iPhone came out, the then CEO of Microsoft, Steve Ballmer, he made this complaint that who's ever going to use the iPhone? The business people will never use an iPhone. And what he forgot to realize is that business people are consumers too. Employees are consumers too. And when you saw something that would fit in your life that you didn't even know existed, it's fascinating how enticing that is. And then you realize there was a need that I didn't even know I had. And it was because they listened and they saw and they just were able to kind of see that. And I think that to me is a little bit different. And I think for me, it's how do you know your user? You talk to them. You also watch them and see how they behave.
Well, I think all this is also grounded in the concept of jobs to be done. So if you're listening to this and you don't know what it is, look it up, watch a TED Talk, read a quick book, listen to a podcast, whatever about jobs to be done. But the concept literally is that the job to be done doesn't change. It's the solution that evolves over time, right? So I used to walk somewhere. I used to use a horse and a buggy somewhere, but I was trying to get from point A to point B. And so what changed? Well, all of a sudden cars showed up and then taxis showed up and then Uber showed up. But the job to be done did not change. I want to get from point A to point B. I used to ride a buggy, then I did a train. Now I do a plane, and soon I might do, flying cars, whatever it is. It's still point A to point B. And so that solution of I used to barter fish and now I use Bitcoin, same job to be done, different solution. So if you can anchor on job to be done, no matter what it is you're doing or whatever it is you're selling, that doesn't change. What changes is the solution and the capability. When the BlackBerry was out, not everybody had high-speed internet. When the BlackBerry was out, people didn't even have email yet. When the BlackBerry first came out, right, when Netflix first came out, we also didn't have high-speed internet in our homes. We had DVD players and VHSs. So where did they start? They started with mail order. They didn't start with streaming. So you have to think through the life cycle of what is the job to be done, what can we technically do today, and where do we think it's going to go in the future?
And I would say to that point, though, I'm sorry, real quick, is the idea like if you think about it, the job to be done at point A to point B, well, Uber is the exact opposite. It gets you the B to point A, so you don't have to go from point A to point B. So it's the same concept of what was the job to be done? Me going out to pick up food, me going out to eat. Now it's like, well, I still want to eat. Maybe the way I want to do that's different, and that has changed. And that's where innovation happens. And so you're right. I mean, the job never changes, but the way that it happens doesn't have to stay the same.
Yeah, but the timing is what's critical. Because if you think you think of pets.com in 2001 or 2, it failed miserably versus Chewy, right? Mm-hmm. And Blockbuster tried to do what Netflix did, streaming sort of 10 years before. And so timing, sequence, which was another part of Growth IQ, is all important. But if you can really land on what is the job to be done, of what your product or service or your company does, then it's your job to always look across industry and say, so when people used to say, I don't want to be Uberized, or I need to Uberize my business, it was not about getting into the ride-hailing business. It was about how do I change the solution for the job to be done I am doing right now, right? That's what that was all about.
Do you think it's possible to know that the timing is right in the moment, or is it only something that you know after the fact?
So I'd say one, where companies make where they have a huge miss, let me say, is that they don't hang on long enough, right? They go, we did this, it's been 3 months, it's not working, let's kill it and move on. And then sure enough, 8 months later, or a year later, they go, okay, let's do it again, instead of hanging on long enough. So you don't want to get too far ahead of the market, because unless you're someone like an Amazon, or an Apple, or right where you've got lots and lots of capital you can, hang on businesses that are going to lose money for a decade. Not many companies can do that, right? So you have to make sure you don't get too far ahead of where, quote unquote, the customer, the solution for that job to be done, you don't want to get too far ahead, right? So even if you think like what Pablo was just mentioning, well, I want food delivered to me right now, using a ride hailing, Uber Eats or a Grubhub or something like that, right, to get it. Or are you going to use a robot? And so you could argue that, but robots haven't taken off yet because there's a lot of things that have to get into place before you have all these robots on sidewalks, right? I mean, so you can't get too far ahead and make a bet. You've got to also just be just slightly ahead of where your customers are and welcome them when they show up.
Fantastic. Well, this has been a really terrific conversation. I do want to ask you both one final question, and it's a question that we ask everybody who guests on our podcast. What does digital mean to you?
I have been so deep in tech for so long that for me, it's really about how can I do things faster, smarter, more efficiently in like my work, like what I do daily, but more importantly for customers, how can they drive costs out of the business by automating, using predictive and AI and all of those things. I think it is literally going from analog to something that is technology driven. And it's not that everything needs to be digital and everything needs to be analog. There is the benefit between both working in harmony. So I do think tech is the foundation for digital, but not everything has to be digital.
The idea for me of digital is returning humanity back to what work used to be. And I think that looking at the way the processes and things that we've created, we've become the robots. Everything that we do is all about, process and how we do things. And to me, digital is a way for us to kind of remove some of those inefficiencies and the blocking and tackling so I can get back to being a human. And there is a balance of understanding, what can be connected and what can't. But in the end, one day I want to be able to wake up and not have to ever touch a screen. I want to just be able to have the things that I need done and never have to really worry about it. We're not there yet, and we probably won't be there for a while, but that's the vision that I see. And so I imagine a world that's going to happen. And so for me, digital is just an aspect of how we get there. It's founded by technology, but it's built around human behavior.
So I'll say that the second my Apple Watch talks to my scale in my bathroom and locks my refrigerator, I'm out. I'm out. I'm out.
Noted. Well, this has been a terrific conversation. Final point, how can our listeners find you? How can they follow you and stay connected to what you're up to? Tiffani?
I'm super active on Twitter at Tiffani_Bova, and I'm also super active on LinkedIn and Instagram.
Fantastic. Pablo?
LinkedIn's probably the best place to find me. It's just Pablo Alejo.
Well, thank you both. This has been a terrific episode of This is Digital. Thank you for joining.
Thanks for listening to This is Digital. If you enjoyed today's show, please follow or subscribe on your preferred podcast app. And don't forget to leave us a review. For more information on This is Digital, visit westmonroe.com/thisisdigital.